I want to share with you a little bit about how to do this activity, this always, sometimes, never true activity, using the Venn diagram that you saw in the notes. You see this Venn diagram, that'll really help you. We're just going to be talking about this parallelogram Venn diagram, but I want to show you how to do the drag and drop matching here. So I have a circle here that I want to share with you. This is a quadrilateral, right? And we've talked about a few different figures. Now in our quadrilateral, we've also talked about parallelograms, right? I'm going to draw that parallelogram. So let me start by saying this. A parallelogram is always a quadrilateral, right? But a quadrilateral is not always a parallelogram. Just because it has 4 sides doesn't mean it's always a parallelogram. So the way to prove something, whether something is always or not, or sometimes, is if you can figure out one counter example. So remember, a counter example is proving something wrong. If you can think about a counter example, then it's not always going to be true. It could sometimes be true, or it could never be true. So let's talk about this parallelogram here. Now in our parallelogram, we have rectangles and rhombi, right? So we're going back to our family tree. We have a rectangle and a rhombus. Remember, rhombus. So here, let's talk about this. A rectangle is always a parallelogram, and it's always a quadrilateral. But a rectangle is never a rhombus, okay? If the rectangle and rhombus are together, then it's called a square. Remember that the square has everything. So a square is always a rectangle, a square is always a rhombus, a square is always a parallelogram, and a square is always a quadrilateral. But not all quadrilaterals are squares, right? Just some of them. So sometimes they're squares. Sometimes parallelograms are squares. Sometimes rhombi are squares, and sometimes rectangles are squares. But rhombuses are never, and rhombi are never rectangles, and rectangles are never rhombi, okay? So just think about that. If you can think about a counterexample, then that'll help you do the activity. So let's look at the activity. A parallelogram is a quadrilateral. Well, that is always true, right? Because it's inside. Let me pull this up for us. Where did it go? I lost it. I dragged it somewhere. There it is. How do I get that? There we go. A parallelogram is always a quadrilateral. So that is always true. Let's go back to it. What about this one? The diagonals of a rhombus are congruent. Well, when could the diagonals of a rhombus be congruent? Let's look at our Venn diagram. A rhombus doesn't ever have congruent diagonals unless it's a square, right? So that is sometimes true. Okay, a rectangle is a square. Sometimes that's true. A rectangle has perpendicular diagonals. Is that ever true? No, because a rectangle is never a rhombus. So it never has perpendicular diagonals. All right, so hopefully that helps you when you're doing your activity. When you're finished, go to File, and you can say, you can download it as a PDF document, or you can print it, or you can do, I think downloading as a PDF is probably your best bet, or you can just snip it if you'd like to snip it and send it to me as a JPEG. Hopefully that helps you get through it.